North Carolina is just one of two states that has a competitive race for governor in November, the other one being New Hampshire. So we're really not going to talk a lot about governor's races as we get closer to the election because, quite frankly, there's only two that we can really focus on. And I talked about New Hampshire many months ago, likewise with North Carolina. So I wanted to sort of brush up on these races because North Carolina in particular is one of these seven quote-unquote toss-up states. And I think this governor's race is going to be very important. So we're going to talk about this election, ultimately determine where it is at this point in time and where it's likely to end up in November. So we're going to get to all of that in just a second. But first, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So North Carolina, as we mentioned, is one of the swing states in the 2024 cycle. Now, despite its moniker as a swing state, North Carolina actually hasn't voted for a Democrat to federal office since 2008 with Barack Obama. So from 2012 all the way to 2020, it's voted straight Republican in presidential and Senate contests. But when it comes to governor's races, North Carolina is very different. In fact, North Carolina actually only voted for one Republican for governor in the entire 21st century, and that was Pat McCrory in 2012. Every other year, the state elected a Democrat for the top office. And the latest, of course, was in 2020 when Roy Cooper ended up winning re-election as governor by a margin of 250,000 votes against the then Lieutenant Governor Dan Forest. So North Carolina does have a blue tinge to it when it comes to some of these statewide offices. And what's interesting is that these races are always very competitive. I mean, if we go back to the Attorney General's race, for example, his margin of victory was only 14,000 votes, or 50.1 to 49.9. So incredibly close. We're talking about razor-thin margins. And if we take a look at Lieutenant Governor, Mark Robinson won a comparably larger margin of victory, 51.6 to 48.4. So when you compare the two electorally, Mark Robinson has done better in his statewide elections in terms of margins than Josh Stein. In fact, in 2016 and 2020, Josh Stein just won by the skin of his teeth in the state. But I guess that is something to be said about a Democrat winning in a red state. North Carolina, even though it is competitive, is mostly Republican. Republicans typically win the state by several points. I mean, if we go back to 2020, even though Roy Cooper was able to carry the state in the governor's election, Tom Tillis was reelected to Senate by a margin of 1.8, and Donald Trump, of course, carried the state against Joe Biden by 1.3, despite overall the national environment moving to the left. So North Carolina has stayed reliably Republican over the past 14 years or so. So if we take a look at the governor's race as a whole, so far, if we take a look at the polling, Josh Stein leads in the majority of polls. He also leads in fundraising. He's raised about $33 million compared to Robinson's 15.8. So he is certainly a leader in the fundraising and also in the polls. Now, polls in North Carolina, by and large, tend to overestimate Democratic support. I mean, Hillary Clinton was leading in North Carolina on election day back in 2016, and Donald Trump ultimately won the state by almost 4 percentage points. So, you know, polls are very friendly to North Carolina Democrats. And if we take a look at the RCP average in this race, Josh Stein is up by 5.5. So if you were to take a 3 or 4 point swing in the Republican direction, he would still win this race very narrowly. So far, the polling indicates Josh Stein is the favorite. Now, as I mentioned, Democrats are overestimated in North Carolina polls conventionally. The only exception to that in recent history really was the 2022 midterms when you had Ted Budd leading his Democratic opponent, Sherry Beasley, by, I think it was 5 or 6 points. And then on election day, only wins by around 4 or so. So Ted Budd was up big in the polling, and ultimately he underperformed in the actual results. So polls aren't always favorable to Democrats, but for the most part, the track record seems to be that way. Roy Cooper was also viewed more favorably in his race for re-election in 2020. He only ended up winning by several points. He was up by like 8 points in the polling. And then, of course, Pat McCrory was down considerably in 2016 and only ended up losing by around 10,000 votes. More often than not, we see this trend. Now, in terms of Mark Robinson as a candidate, I think he is a more controversial candidate. He's very staunchly conservative, which isn't really a bad thing in North Carolina. Again, it's a more conservative leaning state, but he has said a lot of controversial statements and taken a number of very controversial stands on issues like abortion, gender issues, that Josh Stein has put on blast throughout the state. And that's not really going to hurt Mark Robinson in rural areas as much as it's going to hurt him in these more urban areas that are trending more leftward. Wake County, for example, suburban county, home to Raleigh. This area has been bleeding Republican votes for decades now. It was historically more of a swing county, maybe a Republican-leaning county in the later 20th century. And then, of course, now it's a safe blue county. So obviously Robinson's not going to win this county, but he wants to have a decent showing here. And if 2020 is any indicator, he wants to get at least 36% of the vote here. Now, if we look at the governor's race, Roy Cooper got 65% of the vote. Dan Forest only got around 33.2%. So Robinson needs to get closer to the Trump number in populous Wake County. Charlotte, Mecklenburg County, this is the most populous county in the state. Obviously, he needs to get somewhere in the low to mid 30s. You know, anything lower than that would certainly mean the end for his election prospects. Dan Forest got 30% of the vote here. He ended up losing. Tom Tillis got 33%. And Donald Trump got 31.6%. So Robinson needs to get somewhere in that range in order to win. Now, for somebody like Josh Stein, he just needs to hold Biden's margins in these counties and possibly overperform a bit more in rural areas. And his election history shows that he has been able to overperform in rural North Carolina, this eastern portion of the state, even in the West to an extent. So he's been able to run up the margins in a lot of these areas higher than other Democratic contenders for president. That's the only reason why he's in the seat he's in right now. In my opinion, Robinson is still a slight underdog in this race, not just because of North Carolina's trends as a whole, but because of who he is as a candidate. Had Republicans nominated somebody who was just your standard Republican, I would say this is more of a 50-50 race, but I certainly think Robinson is at a disadvantage. Now, as we pointed out earlier, he was more successful in his statewide race. He got 51.6% of the vote. That's much higher than Donald Trump's 49.9% when you consider that this is a very close state. But Robinson's past and political positions and more of his controversial statements has been put on blast more so now than it was back when he was running for a row office back in 2020. So I think that's certainly going to hurt him. Now, in terms of his support among Republicans, Tom Tillis, the Republican senator who was on the ballot with him in 2020, refused to endorse him. A number of other North Carolina Republicans have refused to endorse him. And this does remind me of something that happened 2 years ago in Pennsylvania when you had a similarly controversial candidate who was staunchly conservative, had a lot of problematic statements, and ultimately ended up taking his party down to a crushing defeat. Doug Mastriano was probably one of the worst nominees for governor in Pennsylvania in a very long time. His candidacy could arguably be blamed for Republicans' incredibly poor performances throughout the state, because it wasn't just the governor's race. They lost the Senate race, they lost the state house, and numerous other local elections. So not to compare Robinson to Mastriano, because I think there are a number of differences, but it does echo, in a sense, the sentiment that we had 2 years ago with Mastriano. Now, Robinson does have some things on Mastriano. He's much more charismatic. He is running in a more traditionally conservative state. He's running in the South. Pennsylvania is a Rust Belt state. So you have a very different cultural climate in these two states. You have a much more evangelical Christian climate in North Carolina. And Pennsylvania is just more of your middle-of-the-road Rust Belt Midwestern sort of state. Much more secular, not as culturally conservative. So a cultural warrior like somebody like Doug Mastriano obviously did very poorly here. I don't expect Mark Robinson to be nearly as much of a liability to the GOP as Doug Mastriano, even if I think he is the underdog, because as we pointed out, Democrats typically win races for governor. Josh Stein is very well funded, and ultimately North Carolina just seems more comfortable electing these types of candidates to governor and electing a Republican legislature to sort of provide a check, because Roy Cooper basically has no power when it comes to passing legislation, because he has to go up against a veto-proof Republican majority that can just override every single veto that he puts forward. So Republicans' best hopes, if Mark Robinson loses, is that they hold their supermajority. But I think in a general election environment, 2024, that could be very difficult. Especially if Donald Trump performs worse in North Carolina than he did in 2020. And a number of these districts have been changed with redistricting since the last election. North Carolina got new maps for Congress, and I believe also the lower chambers as well, though correct me if I'm wrong about that. But I'm pretty sure that one of the Republicans, who was formerly a Democrat, who switched parties, is actually in a safe blue district. So she's very likely to lose her seat. Republicans would have to gain another seat somewhere else. And I think, again, in a 2024 presidential environment, even though North Carolina is more likely than not to go Republican at this point in time, I think it's going to be very difficult to pick up a Republican seat in the state house. So ultimately, Republicans' best hope is that Mark Robinson does win. He could, with the Republican legislature, push the state more towards the right, because out of all the battleground states, North Carolina is the most rightward leaning. I'm most comfortable in predicting North Carolina out of the other battlegrounds because it is traditionally Republican, so it's very likely to go Republican again. But this election is certainly going to be very close at this point in time. Again, I think Josh Stein is the slight favorite. Mark Robinson is very popular with the base, but I think Republicans voted more with their heart rather than their heads when it came to the primary, and any other Republican I think would have a much easier time winning this race against Josh Stein, because I think Josh Stein is sort of going to be viewed as sort of the inoffensive Democrat, similar to Roy Cooper, and I think somebody like Mark Robinson is going to turn off a lot of moderates, especially in urban and suburban North Carolina. And these areas are growing very fast. They're home to a lot of educated voters, and Republicans are doing poorly with this demographic. And I think somebody like Mark Robinson at the top of the ticket doesn't really help Republicans in that regard. I think, again, one of the things he has going for him certainly is that he's already won statewide. Doug Mastriano can't say that. He's only been elected to a very Republican state Senate seat. So, you know, he does have a track record of being able to win. But again, this was a much more low profile race. Now we're talking about the race for governor. It's at the top of the ticket. And I think a lot of the focus is going to be on the very controversial things he's said and the positions he's taken, especially when it comes to abortion in a state that, again, is culturally conservative. But I would hedge to bet that the majority of voters in North Carolina are pro-choice. So I certainly think some of his abortion comments are certainly going to hurt him. So again, we're going to revisit this race as we get closer, but so far I would say it probably leans Democrat. If I had to guess, I'd say Josh Stein wins by around 3 or 4 points at this point in time. But we could have a big shakeup in the race. But again, Robinson is polling at just 40%. Stein is at 46%. And this is kind of, again, reminding me of the Pennsylvania governor's race, where at some point Mastriano was actually polling better than Dr. Oz. And then, of course, after the end of the summer, you saw a massive swing in the polls against him. We could very well see the same thing here, but only time will tell. We'll see if Donald Trump actually decides to do more rallies in North Carolina to try to get Robinson over the finish line, because, as I mentioned, I think he's a slight favorite in North Carolina, so potentially he could try to use his coattails, but that might not work. Again, in 2020 and 2016, Donald Trump carried North Carolina, and so did Democrat Roy Cooper. So again, the circumstances in 2016 were a bit interesting because Roy Cooper was going up against Pat McCrory, who was very unpopular, and Pat McCrory almost won. So he came within 0.2% of winning re-election. So I certainly wouldn't count Mark Robinson out just yet. But anyway, that's it for today's video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed. Subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell notification so you miss any more videos I put out. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.